So I'd like to welcome everybody to our webinar today. I'm Jeanette Beninati, the Marketing Director at Reading Horizons. Our webinar is If, Then, Next, Strategies and Support for Teaching K-3 Readers. Today we have our dynamic duo of literacy with us. We have Donell Pons on my left anyway, who is our Literacy and Reading Coordinator from American International School of Utah. And we have Stacy Hurst with us as well, who is the Chief Education Officer at Reading Horizons and a professor at Southern Utah University. So welcome, and thank you for being here. Reading Horizons would like to thank you for joining us today. We have reading instructional materials, technology tools, and professional learning. Reading Horizons is where reading momentum begins. If you'd like to contact us, you can go to our website at www.readinghorizons.com, or you can call us at 800-333-0054. We would love to hear from you. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the webinar over to our dynamic duo, to Stacy and Donell.
Great, thank you.
Oh, thanks.
So Stacy and I, we loved this topic, didn't we, Stacy?
We did.
Yeah. So hopefully we can replicate some of the conversations we've had, because they've been good. We both enjoyed them. And we realize it's a lot, right? That's the other thing is Stacy and I were talking about how we've promised a lot today. It's strategies and support for teaching K-3 readers. And then there's also parents. And so we're going to try to provide enough for everyone and hopefully not too much, because we realize there can be information overload. So we think we might have struck the right balance for this. And we've titled it If, Then, Next. We kind of use that theme a little bit throughout the presentation. So hopefully that'll help orient you to the information as well. We'll do the opening of the If, Then, Next. So if students are introduced to reading, based on what we know from the science of reading, guiding instruction, then students will have the most favorable environment to take the next step toward growth-oriented, independent reading and writing. And so that's what we're going to be looking at today. That's our theme for today. And educators in K-3 are trained to help your student become a reader and writer. However, parents and guardians, as was mentioned, are an important part of that journey. Some students may need more support than others to become readers and writers, and we realize that. And so I have 4 children. My relationship with the teachers of my children were different given the needs of my children. We understand that. And so some may be more involved in the classroom because their children need them to be, their students do. So we'll talk about that too as we go. First, to begin with, the foundation of everything, the science of reading. And Stacy, I'm going to turn over to you to talk about those first few slides.
So yes, at the heart of what we're going to be talking about today is a lot, decades and decades of research into what goes into learning how to read, what's happening in our brain, and also what we need to be attending to as we teach reading. So we always start with this simple view of reading. As anybody on this webinar probably knows, reading, especially in English, is not what we would call simple, right? Or we might not even be having this webinar. It's a very complex process, but the simple view of reading, thank you to Goff and Tunmer, is easily communicated. And really, they just put it in 2 different categories that, again, a lot goes into each category, but essentially it's a math equation. So we know that readers need to be able to decode text, and that really means just be able to read the words on a page. And then also have language comprehension, understanding, speaking, and listening, and how the language works. Now you'll notice that is a multiplication symbol and not an addition symbol. And we need both of those to have what we know of as reading comprehension, to be able to read the words on a page and get the meaning from it. So we can't have one without the other. No amount of decoding can compensate for a lack of language comprehension, and no amount of language comprehension can compensate for the inability to read or decode words on a page. So that is the simple view of reading, and what we're going to talk about today will fall into those 2 categories. This is Hollis Scarborough's reading rope, And she actually demonstrates really well here what goes into reading comprehension as well. She breaks down each of those areas that Goff and Tunmer have identified a little bit more thoroughly. And I like this as an educator too. The simple view of reading tells me what needs to be happening in the brain for reading comprehension to happen. And this reading rope helps me to, as an educator, to know what areas I need to be instructing. And Donell and I will talk a little bit more about that today. But essentially, we have two major strands, that's decoding and language comprehension. And you can see on the decoding strand, that's where we have our phonological awareness, reading and spelling, those pattern recognition. And then also on the upper strand is where our language comprehension skills come in: background knowledge, vocabulary knowledge, the structure of the language that we're reading and speaking in, verbal reasoning, and a knowledge of literacy in general, genres and formats and all kinds of things. Now, in that bottom part of the rope, the reader's task is to become increasingly automatic. So as teachers, we get to help facilitate that. We're going to talk about how to do that today. And then also the reader's task on the upper strand of the rope is to become increasingly strategic. So we know what to do when that language comprehension breaks down when we're reading. And all of that works together over time. I heard Hollis Scarborough say that she would have added an arrow at the bottom of this graphic to say that this is a process that happens over time. And that fluent reading that leads to understanding text. So that is Scarborough's reading rope.
Great. Thank you, Stacy. And I like that you've added over time, because that is something that we have a tendency not to remember and keep in the conversation, is that even though we are talking about a lot of different elements, this is over time, as you say, that we get there. So structured literacy. This is a term, Stacy, you and I were familiar with it years ago. A lot of people were talking about it. And we even had a conversation last night where we said, wasn't there a time when the International Dyslexia Association was trying to copyright the term structured literacy? And structured literacy was very helpful when we were introduced to it, because it was a way of talking about what should be in a really good lesson based on the science of reading, what we know about the science of reading. And it was a nice way of kind of coalescing and condensing down what was needed in a lesson. And it's kind of gone away. We haven't really seen the term used much. And so we bring it back here just to orient us. And this is a graphic from the International Dyslexia Association. What I love about this graphic is it tells us everything about what's in a lesson that has the components of the science of reading. And we start out with, why is there structured literacy? And it talks about the challenge that some individuals may have coming to be readers, that we do have a group of individuals, we know at least about 20% of the population that we know is going to struggle because they have probably dyslexia. But then there's another segment of the population that could have been really good readers had they received some really good explicit instruction. They didn't really need to struggle, but the instruction maybe wasn't where it needed to be in order for that student to take off. And that's another segment of the population. And so that's what I like about structured literacy. This whole infographic is breaking that down. So why are we leaning into structured literacy for a whole class? And could it benefit everybody? And yes, it can benefit everybody. And so that's a good thing to keep in mind too. And then we look underneath there, and structured literacy's elements work together. You'll see that it tells you what components should be in that lesson: that phonology, the sound symbol association, the syllables, the morphology. We're going to get into those as we go through. And then over on the other side, which is really nice to see too, is how do we do that in the classroom? So that's where in the classroom we have it's systematic and it's cumulative, right? It's explicit. It's diagnostic as we present this information. So as I say, I thought this was a really excellent graphic. It came out years ago and haven't really seen it being used again. And so this is from the International Dyslexia Association website. If you want to download it or go and look at it, you're more than welcome to. It's a great one. And so what I did is pulled out, what are those 10 elements? What are the big elements that come out of the infographic? So let's maybe take a little look at it. What are those features, the what and the how? And number one, the instructional tasks are modeled and clearly explained, especially when first introduced or when a student is having difficulty. So notice that instructional tasks are modeled and clearly explained. Number two, highly explicit instruction is provided, not only in important foundational skills such as decoding and spelling, but also in higher level aspects of literacy, such as syntax, reading comprehension, and text composition. So we don't just leave the highly explicit instruction for decoding, but we take it into those higher levels also of instruction. And important prerequisite skills are taught before students are expected to learn more advanced skills. So that's just building on learning from the basics and building on up. Meaningful interactions with language occur during the lesson. So that's being woven in, and we'll see some examples of that as we move through our PowerPoint today. And there are multiple opportunities that are provided to practice those instructional tasks. So again, it's not just one and done. It's not just tacked on to the end, woven throughout multiple opportunities. Well-targeted corrective feedback is provided after initial student responses. So I'm not allowed to continue to struggle and not understand what I'm doing wrong, but rather I'm given feedback right away to know what it is I should need to correct. And 7, the student effort is encouraged at all points along the way. And that's what all that feedback and providing explicit instruction does, is guarantees an opportunity for the student to be encouraged because they can understand what's happening. The lesson engagement during teacher-led instruction is monitored and scaffolded. So the teacher is always looking to see and taking a check to see if the students are engaged. Are they able to do those tasks and activities? And if not, I have some things in my back pocket I can pull out to get the students engaged, to help them. That's the scaffolding. The lesson engagement during independent work is monitored and facilitated. So I'm always noticed the teacher is always there to make sure along the way that if there's a challenge or something that the teacher needs to engage with, the teacher can do that. And 10, students successfully complete activities at a high criterion level of performance before moving on to more advanced skills. And Stacy, you and I have talked about that being accurate. That piece that's really important is making sure students are accurate.
Yeah. Absolutely. I also love these 10 tenets because they focus on facilitating what needs to happen in the brain for reading to happen. It's not sit and get, it's not us talking at the students. There's a high focus on having the student engaged because in the end of the day, it needs to happen in their brain, right?
Yep. Absolutely. That's a good point.
This absolutely addresses that really well.
And so then we leaned into a 6-step lesson plan. So we have these 10 points. We've looked at the infographic from IDA. So what does that look like in a lesson? And this one comes from the Reading League, which recently had a conference. It was a fantastic conference if you had a chance to attend. And there was a presentation where they laid out a 6-step lesson plan. This is the how. And again, we may already be doing this in a lot of classrooms. This may just be reinforcement to say, oh, yep, this is what I'm doing. Maybe you need a tweak. So you're looking and you're saying, I've got 5 of those, but I didn't notice I was missing one, or I should lean into some others. So again, this is should be familiar territory, right? And also, this should be familiar because it relies on the science. So we're not seeing things that are extremely different from each other. We should be seeing things that feel familiar if we're aware of the science. And so we're going to look at those 6-step lesson plan. We're going to take each one apart from 1 to 6, and we'll move through here. So we'll start with PA proficiency. So we've gone through many terminologies with this, haven't we, Stacy? It's been phonemic awareness. Well, we've heard all kinds of things. And now it's phonemic proficiency, which I kind of like better a little bit because it really does tell the story, right? You need to be proficient, not just aware. Right?
Yeah, that's the second step, right? First awareness, then proficiency.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's good to include it. And this was a great graphic as well. This one I picked up from the Reading League. It's probably been other places as well. This is not new again. And there are probably many of you that have seen it, but it's a nice reminder. There are 3 phases of word reading development and their phonological counterparts. What I like is the side-by-side on this one. On the one column, we have the phonological development, and then on the other side, we have the reading development that lines up. So this is nice to look at, I think. And that first one, early phonological awareness, look what's labeled under there. So we have rhyming, alliteration, syllable segmentation, first sound awareness. Notice on the reading development side, we have letter name and letter sound knowledge. So those two are coalescing or aligning. When we're teaching and we have that early skill of phonological awareness, the thing that is occurring with our reading development as well. Number 2, the basic phonemic awareness, so that's segmentation and blending. Look over on the reading development side, we have phonic decoding and basic spelling skills. So that's, again, that should be a really nice alignment of using the sounds and our foundational understanding of sounds to move us into those other steps where we introduce letters and are working with letters. And these are our quick progressions, right, with working with sounds and letters. Advanced phonemic awareness is best assessed via phonemic manipulation and also timed. So this is where you're automatic, but you're also that you're so quick with that automaticity. And oftentimes we don't really think a lot about that, but a lot of my struggling readers that I have as adults, they are still very slow when they're accessing their phonemic awareness, very slow. And so it's working on those skills to get them automatic is important. And then reading development notice, we have orthographic mapping, there's efficient sight word acquisition, and rudimentary version of number 3 overlaps with number 2. So again, there's a progression through these, and they're not smooth and not absolute, right? But we do have some overlap there. Okay.
Yeah, and this is a really good graphic to remind us too that we don't teach either one of these in action, and there is some overlap, right? So just know, as educators and parents, being aware that these things happen and their counterpart, that these things developmentally need to be happening, then we can help facilitate it in our
Absolutely.
instruction.
And for me, Stacy, like I say, working at the adult end a lot, that's where I spend most of my day, understanding that what does an adult reader need? Well, the same things that a young reader needs, right? Those same skills. Dr. David Kilpatrick is always very quick to point that out. And that's very informative for making sure that you've provided those opportunities for older students too, to receive the same skills that the younger students have. And I see those holes missing all the time for older students. They just never got them, right?
Yeah, and my focus has been K-3 in my professional career. I taught first grade, and then I was a literacy coach, but I do tutor, and the older readers that I tutor, we often think, I used to think anyway, that we were done teaching phonemic awareness by first grade, right? That was my task as a first grade teacher, and then we don't attend to it. But I've absolutely seen the value of attending to those advanced phonemic awareness tasks, like you were pointing out on that slide. And they both have a reciprocal impact. So we're not just saying we think these might be a good idea to address at the same time. We've seen it. Research has seen it. I've seen it when I end up tutoring older struggling readers, or even beginning struggling readers. When I buoy one up, the other improves. And so, but we have to attend to both of them.
Absolutely, yeah. And Stacey, I was just gonna say before we get excited over this next, slide here, this is a pilot so far, so no, we don't have this available, but it's a
Yeah.
pilot, and Stacey, you and I and another colleague spent more than a summer, way more than a summer, it's been years in the making of going over a phonemic awareness, scope and sequence in a program so that teachers could have this available. And this is one that we've been piloting and working with, but we were so excited. We wanted to show what that would look like. So notice that it has in there a second grade, it has week 1. So each day you know where you are headed, and it has a progression. You have quick tasks. So it provides teacher information there. It tells you what you're going to be doing. And notice we're here on Monday. So it's for all of the days of the week. And that you have a review, and then you're doing 2 tasks. And this information came from a lot of the research that's been provided. So remember, it should sound familiar if you've been looking at the research and listening to those who are in the field. And that should be informing what we're doing in the classroom, transferring that into what we do in the classroom. And so those are activities or tasks, as I say, out of a program here. And then what do we do at the if then next? So if your students do not have phonemic proficiency, then small group time doing the same thing with feedback and practice is needed. So what if my students didn't pick it up, or they're having challenges? That's what you do. So if your students don't have it, it's difficult for them, then you're going to back up, have small group time, and you're going to do that same thing with feedback and practice. You may scaffold. So maybe you're going to, have some chips on the table, bring down the sounds if your student needs to have something there to scaffold with. And then you will eventually remove the scaffold to make sure the student can do it. So you can bring in scaffolding and then remove it. You can do that in small group time. And then that feedback and practice is vital there. And then assess and reteach and teach again, right, if you need to. And then how can parents support this phonemic proficiency? They can do it in many, many ways. They can do it by engaging their students in conversation, spoken language, reciting nursery rhymes. I was telling Stacy I have great memories of my mom, a former school teacher, who did nursery rhymes with me all the time when I was a little girl. I just had fun with it. I didn't realize, but my mother knew the implications of that and laying that groundwork because she taught in the early grades. And then you can also play the echo game using compound words with 2 and 3 syllable words, dropping the first sound in a word to create a new word. Those are all fun and helpful phonemic awareness activities that parents can do that are not difficult, are not hard, but can provide a lot of assistance to their student if they need it, right?
Yeah, and there's support for teachers in curriculum, as Donell just pointed out, and this idea too that most of our students, again, we're going to use phonological and phonemic awareness instruction with our whole class. Most of our students will acquire it quickly based on explicit systematic instruction. But then we will have students who struggle. I remember, and this falls in the category of I wish I knew better at the time. I remember noticing very distinctly that I had a student who could not rhyme to save his life. We tried everything. And I noticed that and I thought it was odd, but I didn't know what to do to address it. So the support for teachers and parents is the fact that we do have curriculum and resources that will help your students. Your students who are not as quick to pick it up or to demonstrate it need the same thing, just more intense instruction and a lot of deliberate practice and feedback. So that is good news for educators as well. We don't have to do something entirely different. We don't have to stand on our head in a corner and try something totally new. We know what works. It just, for some of our students, takes more time and deliberate intentional instruction and practice.
Yeah. So sound symbol correspondences. Let's look at that one. That was number 2 out of our 6-step lesson plan. Again, this is a pilot of this particular. Stacy and I and our colleague have been very busy this summer, hadn't we, Stacy?
Yes.
And prior. So this is an example. There are others available, but this is an example again of a pilot that we're running of cards that are involved with a sound wall. So eventually this is part of a larger piece that's called a sound wall. And here we have a phoneme grapheme card. Notice there are a lot of graphemes. You won't introduce all the graphemes at once, right? So developmentally, what is appropriate for your students. So you may only have one grapheme at this point and the sound, but the focus is on the phoneme to then link it to the grapheme. And notice they're together on the card because we want to be able to make that relationship very quickly, right? We don't want to continue to do the phonemes all by themselves, but rather that relationship is the important part, right? Getting them together. And so we just wanted to point that out here with this card. These are fantastic. And in fact, Stacy, I was excited to report to you that I use them with some older students that I work with, and they love them as much as younger students love them. So that's fantastic to be able to show them the articulation features of the sounds that we make when we have spoken language. And then quickly, we wanted to show that this can be part of, like I said, a larger introduction of, say, a sound wall, where then once you've introduced those phonemes, you can put them together, say, by nasal, the quality of how they're made. You can put all the nasal sounds together. And again, it talks about the articulation features, and that will be on your sound wall. And students being able to see their mouth and know what their mouth is doing as they make those sounds, those speech sounds. This is powerful, Stacy, so powerful, isn't it?
It is so powerful because at the heart of our language and reading instruction is going to be that speech to text connection, speech to print, right? And this helps students understand that in the most developmentally appropriate way. They're starting with the phoneme, and then we're going to attach the graphemes one at a time in a way that won't overwhelm them.
Yeah, it's great. And then notice we also are going to be very intentional about the way that we introduce the letter that goes with it. And there will be some verbal cues about how we're going to make those letters, and we'll have many opportunities to do it. So maybe you're introducing your consonants with your vowels, whatever your sequence is, but there's also an intentional point at which you're teaching the features of the printed grapheme. And you're going to have the upper and lower case. and have opportunities for your students to practice. We show this one here where it's broken into a letter group one. They're learning in letter groups, and so they have opportunities here to work with those letters. The important thing is there's a sample of appropriately made letter at the beginning for a student to follow, and then they have opportunities to practice and to write their letters as well. And this can be done also, teachers can share these with parents. So I have a son who has dysgraphia. Trust me, we spent a lot of time on this stage and more than I had to with my other children. And so it was a really nice thing to have the teacher provide, okay, this is what we're doing in class. These are the verbal pathways that I'm using to say how we make the uppercase or the lowercase. So I could repeat that at home with my students. So I was reinforcing what the teacher was doing in class. And that was all really important to be able to do that. So we're going to get to that slide there. The next one then is that if, then, next. So if your students are not proficient, accurate, and automatic, then use small groups to teach and practice the same skills. Next, assess and teach what is needed. So this is that what happens if I'm not automatic and accurate with it. You're going to use small groups again to teach and practice, and maybe you have some supports. So obviously for my son who struggled with that, we had supports for him, right? I had additional paper, and sometimes I even had him practicing with his finger first on the table, outlining that letters the teacher showed me to do with him, and then pick up the pencil and work with it. So that can be that support. And there, the parents can support the phoneme, grapheme, correspondence, and knowledge by providing those activities to promote the good letter formation, talking with the teacher. Stacey, I know you had some thoughts on this one too.
Yeah, I love that you highlighted automatic and accurate, and I think where letter formation is concerned, I would also add consistent. I have seen students who, with or without those verbal pathways, if they're creating letters, a specific letter a different way every time, excuse me. So, for example, with the lowercase a, if they draw the line first one time and then the circle, and then the next time they draw the circle and then the line, that is a big indicator and a window into their brain to tell us that they don't have automatic letter recognition. And so that not only helps inform our handwriting instruction, but also our phonemic awareness and our phonics instruction, right? So we need to, there's that phoneme, that sound letter correspondence needs some buoying up. And just like the way that you said, Donnell, then we have small group time to do that. We practice the same skills and we assess and we keep teaching what they need. So those
You know,
are
and
really to keep in mind.
you bet. And Stacey, I'm noticing some comments, people saying that we have parents who are struggling with these things too. So, it's great if you've got a parent who knows what to do to help and can come into class and help. But it is difficult if the parent is also struggling with these things. And, you're absolutely right. I'm just going to say straight up, you are absolutely right. And depending on the environment in which you teach, sometimes you have more challenges than other environments. And I have done the same thing. I've taught in certain areas where that's a challenge more than it is in other areas. What's interesting is trying to find some maybe unique ways around that. I worked in one of the areas that I worked in, we had a lot of individuals who were English as a second language. And so the parents were also learning at the same time. And I provided some after school opportunities that were in the evening. So I'd go home, everybody could have dinner, and I would come back to the school. This was pre-COVID, right? So now we might be even easier to do it online. But the folks
Sure.
would come back who wanted to come back to school later, and we would just do some classes on basic literacy. So who's interested in learning more about letter formation? Who's interested in learning more about how to teach the sounds to their student? And then parents would come. It was interesting. Sure, there were a few in the beginning because everybody's very busy. But when word got out how valuable it was and that parents were actually learning too, then parents had more interest in coming. And so we tried to do those as often as we could. It was also a nice way to get to meet people just in a different way, to have an opportunity. So,
Yeah, I
yeah,
love that. And,
yeah.
even as a first grade teacher, I had monthly parent trainings, but here is a good high quality distinction, right? I am not expecting the parents of my students to,
No, to be the teacher.
and so when we're interfacing with parents, our conversations really will be about how to support that learning, but in a way that doesn't overburden them. And if they don't have the background or they struggle with the same things, then of course we would only be adding insult to injury, right? So
Absolutely.
I think it's, I don't oversimplify it, but it's kind of know your audience, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And parents are a critical part of any classroom community. But again, helping provide support for them where they need it as well, in a way of this should be a happy, enjoyable time with your student. We don't want
Yeah.
to overstress anyone. And
And,
then,
Stacy, I'm glad you brought that up
yeah, go ahead.
because I have a husband who struggles with literacy, right? Of
Yes.
course,
Yeah.
today he is not the man I married, in terms of literacy because he has received so much support. And in fact, he was saying just a few years ago, if I'd have been this guy, I could have done anything. If I'd have been this guy. And it's really hard to hear that, but it's the truth. But what's
Yeah.
interesting is that he really appreciated oftentimes learning things that he could practice to improve his literacy skills. But again, as you say, know your audience. It's how it's presented and how well you understand them and their needs. So that's really important. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Okay, great. So dictation. And Stacy, there's a lot to say here.
There
So,
is a
and I hope
lot.
we can replicate the conversation we had last night because you had some really good points here. We say dictation, but there are a lot of things we're going to cover within this same area, right? And
Yeah.
so,
It,
yeah.
it's
Go
one of
ahead,
my
Stacy.
favorite things to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Love it.
So Stacy, jump in anytime here. I'm gonna
I
have you introduce
will.
us to this slide.
Yeah. So, in a nutshell, I could start by asking, um, those of us in attendance as readers, we're usually more accurate at reading words on a page than we are spelling. But if I were to randomly call on somebody and ask you to spell a word that is a little complex, like let's say the word orange, right? And you could automatically spell that, then I would have a high level of confidence in knowing that if you saw the same word in print, that you could read it. So the reason I love dictation so much is exactly based on this fact that spelling and writing informs reading more than reading informs spelling. And I look at that to mean if my students are able to spell correctly, then I know it's having a really large impact on their reading development. I can't always be as confident with the inverse. So that all leads to how do we map words? And by map, I mean, how do we get them in our long term memory so that we know them? We know that students who do have the ability to orthographically map words know it, they can't help but read. That's what we say, right? Like you're teaching to the point that it just happens seemingly automatically, though we know better. So we want to get it into our phonological long-term memory. So this graphic is from David Kilpatrick, and he does a much better job of explaining this than I do because he's been studying it for a long time, but we've all benefited from his knowledge. So I will do my best to portray this very important concept and why we need to use dictation in our instruction. So as we start with the left side of that graphic with the word read, and because it's in those virgules or slash marks, we know that that's the spoken word, right? And so if a student has that word already in their spoken vocabulary and listening vocabulary, and here's the key to read, the anchor, no matter if we're reading or spelling, is always going to be on the individual phoneme level. So if a student has the word read in their speaking vocabulary, and then based on our phonological and phonemic awareness instruction and our students' ability, can recognize each sound in that word, then they will be able to read it or spell it, right? So they'll turn it literally from speech, process it in their brain, connecting the sounds to the letters, and be able to read it. So the first two examples are what happens in our brain when we're reading a word, right? Or when we're speaking a word and we want to be able to read it or spell it. The third example is that letter sound knowledge is necessary when we're reading too. So we start with the words on a page, but we still have to do the same thing. We have to attach the sound to each letter. Now, the great thing about teaching in this way is that the brain has what has been referred to as the self-teaching hypothesis, and starts to very, very quickly store those spelling patterns in long-term memory. Most students need about 3 to 4 experiences with a word to map those patterns. That's most students. We have some who need far more experiences with it, but then they can automatically read that word and turn that print into speech. So it's turning speech to print and print to speech. But either way, when we're turning those processes inside out, I guess is a good way to put it, they're the inverse of each other. They have to go through that phoneme grapheme mapping. We have to be able to teach kids how to tack on each sound to the spelling pattern. A really simple way to frame it, at least I found this helpful with the students that I work with. I'm teaching pre-service teachers how to teach reading. And I explain it to them in the way that our language is structured essentially. We have 44 phonemes in English that combine in a lot of different ways to make hundreds of thousands of words. And so we have 44 phonemes, 26 letters of the alphabet that we have to represent those phonemes in print in over 250 ways, 250 combinations for that. So either way, at the heart of all of that really is being able to attach that sound to the spelling pattern. So we need to facilitate that in our instruction. We need to let students have time to practice attaching those sounds to the letters they're seeing, or to generate those letters based on the sounds they're trying to spell. And I know that's a very, very complex topic. And we could, David Kilpatrick has written a fantastic book about it, all about it. We could spend a long time on this, but essentially that is what we need to do. You can see the commonality in reading and writing is that we have to go through that process of quickly mapping the letter to the sound it represents, letter or letters.
Yeah. Stacy, I really appreciate you breaking.
Words.
Yeah. Well, no, it wasn't a lot of words. They were all really good words. And I appreciate you breaking that down for us and really remembering what's interesting is just listening to you explain this particular slide and where it is in our conversation. Notice the build up to here, right? And all of the things that we have been getting in line so that when we have opportunities for the activity to occur, right, to be able to map the words, that those skills are there for our students to access. And I oftentimes, Stacy, think of my older learners who have dyslexia and I wonder what they looked like in a class when they were young. And I can only imagine they just didn't have those foundation and they never had the opportunity to get that automatic and accurate to even have an opportunity to map anything, right?
Yeah. Right. And dictation is the way we do that. That is the way we do it. And it's the biggest bang for our buck. So in dictation, just to be clear, we're asking students to spell. We're asking them to spell the words that we're focusing on in those patterns.
Yeah,
That
so here you
becomes
go.
really important. If I don't like the word hack generally, but say this is a hack anytime that you're teaching reading. So if you're teaching a skill that you want students to recognize in print, the fastest way to get that into long-term memory is to also have your students write it. That's going to be the thing that kind of helps solidify it. Again, students will need more practice than others.
You bet.
Also,
And
we want them writing the patterns we're teaching, right? Which is probably why we have that, for example, this slide that Donell chose to use based on the lesson that we would be teaching. So it demonstrates well that you can read all the words on here. That gives the student more practice to get in their long-term memory. And you can also have students spell the words and the sentences on a card like this. You can see that it's going from speech to print and it's building in a very systematic way. So in our instruction, we want to provide as many opportunities for students to do similar activities.
yeah. Great. And so the if then next, if your students are not proficient, then again, you can use small groups to teach the same thing with feedback and practice, opportunities to just repeat. And again, scaffold if needed, right? You're going to break things down if you need to break them down and go back and take them smaller steps. That's another thing. So we talked about this last night too, is breaking things down into smaller units. Now that we're adding a lot of different tasks or activities, breaking down is fine too, and then assess and reteach. And parents can support students by asking the teacher how words are being taught for spelling. So what are you doing to help my student learn to spell, and being able to support that way. And you can support your student by practicing the same method when your student needs help spelling a word. So if your student gets stuck, then maybe I have some of the words or prompts that the teacher is using to get them to really think about, okay, stop, say the word again. Maybe that's what the teacher's having to say the word again. Those sort of things are very helpful. And they're not too many, but just that little peek into what are you doing as the educator in the classroom with my student? How can I help support the student at home? That is, again, if
Yeah,
you have
and
the opportunity.
absolutely. As a parent, that is important to know. As a teacher, start by asking, what am I requiring of my students spelling wise? I tutor a first grader now. I love her. She's so fun to work with. And her spelling words every week, you can tell they are grade appropriate. They're grade level appropriate. But you can also tell a lot about their phonics instruction from those words. And I would generally say, yeah, of course, I'm a reading specialist, so I can look at a list like that and think, you know what, I don't know about that sequence. I don't know if it's developmentally where we need it to be, but they're grade level appropriate. But the way that I support my student is different based on those skills. So as a parent, you can look at that. If your student is bringing home lists of words that are multisyllabic in first grade and they're based on their reading of the basal story of the week and they're not based on phonics instruction, there's not a identifiable pattern, then it will be harder to break that down, right? But we definitely need to be attending to, like Donell, like you said, like we have to start from a simple place and move to more complex.
Yeah, and Stacy, I thank you. I appreciate the fact that you mentioned not everyone is going to know that there's an appropriate way to teach spelling, right? So you will see a
Yeah.
lot of inappropriate things with spelling lists, and we're moving in the right direction, but it's going to take time. The other thing I want to acknowledge is there have been, comments about I don't have parents who have either the time or even the interest, perhaps, in wanting to do this, and not lumping all the parents together too. Someone made the distinction that just because someone is learning English, maybe English is not their first language, doesn't mean they fit into a low socioeconomic class either. So again, you're absolutely right, not making assumptions about parents either, and maybe their interest or disinterest in supporting the student too. So that's always good.
Yeah.
Yeah, nice
And
reminders.
the very heartening thing about that is there have been more and more research studies showing us that we can help mitigate the impact of some of the things that children experience outside of our classroom if we teach them to read, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
those things don't have, we can help. We know more. We can do better.
Yep. Good. Okay, so we come to the last piece, which is my favorite piece. This is the piece we're always trying to head towards is oral reading, right? Getting to the reading piece. And Stacy, you had a really interesting thing you brought up last night of how much time students are actually spending reading in a classroom.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I just perused the abstract of this study, but they were saying that in a day, a student was spending 5 minutes reading,
that's
actually
it.
reading a day in a classroom. And then if you add that up even over a week, that's 25 minutes.
That's
And
it.
students in a typical setting or at school, 6 to 8 hours. We're only asking them to read, to do the thing, to apply what we're teaching
Right.
for that amount of time. It's not acceptable.
Yeah. So Stacy, what grades was that in the study what were
That
those grades?
study was actually K-3,
A3. Interesting.
all of the beginning readers, and I should have come prepared with the name of that study, or at least the researchers, and I'm not. But that I so shocking to me that that was the thing I took away. And
Yeah.
there were different settings, and so some of that text was decodable, some of it was leveled, but I think the bottom line is 5 minutes, no matter what kind of text you're reading, is not ideal. We need to
Okay, so
allow them more opportunities to apply it.
yeah, and what we're talking about here, Stacey, is all kinds of reading, right? And we can
Yeah.
also weave the reading into everything that we're doing in the classroom. I know I'm seeing things about teachers saying, "I'm competing against everything else for reading time. I'm
Yes.
competing against their interest
Yes.
in video games and everything else." And I know, it's true. I know. I feel you, I hear you. I understand exactly what you're talking about. But again, we get in there and we do our best, right? We get in and we do our best. And so looking at words, sentences, passages, decodable text, enriched reading, it all counts. So that's the other thing I want you to know. It all counts, right? So don't be beating yourself up or kicking yourself if you say, well, we spent time looking over words and then we moved to sentences and it's all reading time.
Great.
So
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So that's what's listed here is there's individual words, and those words make up sentences. Those sentences make up passages. So remember that and to build that for your students. It's all important. Decodable text, we've talked about this. It's very important. So that decodable text is carefully sequenced to progressively incorporate words that are consistent with the letter sound relationships that have been taught to the new reader. So decodable text is an important step for the student to be able to practice what has been taught. We've had many conversations, Stacy, about finding appropriate decodable text for older students because we have a lot of students that are exiting third grade that still need opportunities with decodable text and support in those things that are being taught. And there's not a lot of text to be found. And of course, even older than that. And this last conference, I believe it was IDA and even the Reading League, where we had Dr. Julie Washington, putting out a call to action. We need more decodable text for older students because we have a lot of students who need it, right?
Yeah,
And then,
decodable text is a scaffold. It's not
yeah,
something that we expect students to stay in forever,
no,
something
but
available to teachers and students.
yes, and they need that opportunity. And then we move on to enriched reading that includes fiction and nonfiction. Experiences listening to someone else reading a more complex text are also important. So yes, when you read to a student, it is important. That's their ear reading, they're hearing, they're listening, and they're making connections, and they're receiving a lot of background knowledge. Stacy, you know, I'm a big advocate of reading to students. Like you said, you read to your class. I have a child with dyslexia. I have two children with dyslexia. My last child with dyslexia, a more severe case. And this is where he had an opportunity to be able to engage in the text that his peers were able to read, that he wasn't able to read. And then, of course, because his ear listening and ear reading became so advanced, he could listen to books that were well beyond his ability or his peers' ability to read at the time, but he had an interest level in them because of his experience listening to story, right?
And, you know, there's been a lot of really great studies too about reading aloud to children. In children's books, the vocabulary level, the number of rare words per 1,000 is more than students are hearing on TV, or I would even imagine watching TikToks.
Right, right.
Yeah, it's more than in spoken language. So that is all to say that, like, we backing up to the word red, we talked about the color red. If you have it in your oral vocabulary, you're going to be able to recognize, make that connection to it in print and speech a lot faster. So we do need to be exposing our students to that rich text
You
and vocabulary.
bet. So, Stacey, I was just going to show some examples here. This one is from Reading Horizons. It shows you how you might be able to work at the word level, like with one word, individual words. Here, notice we have a lesson that tells you what it is. It's root words, prefixes, and suffixes. We know what we're doing, what the objective is, root words. The grades 2 to 3. So we have this already attached to the assignment. We're not just randomly picking words, right? It goes in a sequence. And then we have an activity to do with those words. This next one is just an example of sentences and being able to show students or have an opportunity for students to see this is a simple sentence. The following statements are true about sentences in English. A simple sentence. A new sentence begins with a capital letter, and then you can read. The students can read. He likes to read. So there's an opportunity to read as you're teaching capital letters. A sentence ends with punctuation, a period, a question mark, or an exclamation point. He likes to read. Again, you have an opportunity to repeat. Nice. A sentence contains a subject that is only given once. So notice how it takes out, the Tom, and says he likes to read. You can have either one. A sentence contains a verb or a verb phrase. So you get the point as you go through. You are reading as well as you are teaching this concept about a simple sentence. And then this one here, we have capitalization activity. It's a sentence. So again, you have an opportunity to not only rewrite, but also to read that sentence as you go through it. And you can also take the chance to review the capitalization, review the punctuation, review the subject. It's all opportunities, right? And then a passage here, we have passages where we can fill in. This is a closed passage. Opportunities, again, we would read. We're going to read that. And then enriched text experiences, being able to have text read to you. Stacy, I know we talked about this one because it's one of my favorites. And I worked at a school where I had students who were all on the autism spectrum. That I was at a charter school. It was very specific for students. And I worked in the high school end, 9 through 12. And my students hadn't had a lot of opportunity, many of them, with really getting into text and going after character development and that sort of a thing. And I remember having some of my best times with this class where I would turn the lights off. We'd do these really fun. So again, make it an experience, right? We are competing with TikTok. We're competing with YouTube. I know
Yes,
we're
we are.
competing. I would flip the lights off. I would shut the blinds, make the room kind of dark, and I would pick a book that fit the setting. Like for this particular group, we needed to do Frankenstein. So we were doing the original Frankenstein and shut all those lights off. And I would tell the students, picture yourselves. I'm going to put you in Italy. We're going to be in an estate. It's dark. It's a rainy weekend because that's the setting for how it was written by the author. And then I would explain and
Yeah.
get into the book. Oh my goodness. The students loved it. They would come into class every day saying, can we turn the lights off? Are we going to read Frankenstein today? So I know we are competing and so we are going to have to kind of think outside the box to get our students into a lot of text. And I know not every text is going to work, not every experience, but there are opportunities of nuggets.
But you know what? And we talked about this last night too. We should not underestimate kids. I shared with you that I was reading the unabridged version of Les Miserables while I was teaching first grade. And no, I was not reading it, all of it to my students. I would read a passage here and there. But I discussed it with them. I let them know that's what I was reading. And we had very fascinating conversations about whether or not Jean Valjean was justified in stealing the bread. And we talked about the importance of being forgiven and forgiving. And you can't underestimate. These were 6 and 7-year olds. And I learned from them, hopefully, as much as they learned from me. Hopefully they were learning from me, but I learned a lot from them.
You
So
bet. So, Stacey, I just wanted to quickly, somebody said, did you give your students a heads up you were going to do that? Absolutely, I did.
yeah,
Yeah. So assume all things were followed as to good protocol. Let's see.
yes.
We're at the end here. So the if then next, if your student's not proficient at the word level, then spend time in small group on word level work. Next, involve plenty of opportunity to assess and reteach in order to be sure your student's ready to move on to the next level, right? So again, you're working in a progression, so you'll have an opportunity to see that when your student needs to work at a certain stage. Parents and guardians can set the stage for a good relationship with reading. Of course, this doesn't happen in every household. We realize that. By spending time in books that you and your student can enjoy together, reading aloud with your student is valuable. So always encourage parents, though, too, that if they are making an effort, that effort is very much helpful to their student, and it does make a difference. So we do appreciate the effort when it is made. And we are at the end of we're now to the questions and answers period. So, Jeanette?
Yes, we are, and we have some time for them. So I'm so excited because we have some great ones in here. And I kind of want to rewind back to the simple view of reading, if that's okay, for the first question. We have a
Sure.
question in here asking about the significance of the multiplication sign, Stacy. So I was hoping maybe you could explain that a little bit. I'll pull up the slide if you'd like, and then we
Yeah,
can
that would
talk
be
about
great.
that.
Thanks. The example that I usually give is another math equation with the really big disclaimer that I am a reading specialist. And I taught first grade, so I didn't go beyond 20 with math. But the thing that really helps demonstrate that to me and the power of that multiplicity, right? The multiplication symbol is, let's say that we have a student. There are about 3 different profiles with this. So we have a student who is really slow at decoding text, not very accurate at all. So we will say that's a zero point 0.5, right? Out of 1 being the highest possible. So zero point 0.5 ability to decode text quickly and proficiently, to use that word. But their language comprehension is stellar. And we do see this profile frequently. In fact, back in my balanced literacy days, I would always get that question. Well, how is it that on a test like the DRA or a running record that in leveled text that my student can get all the comprehension questions right? And that's the important thing, right? It took them way too long to read it, to decode the words, but they got it. And that is because they were relying on their language comprehension. So in this scenario, let's just say this student had a really good comprehension of spoken language and the structure of English and could understand when people were talking, have great conversation. So we'll attach a 1 to that. Well, 0.5 times 1 is 0.5. So that would be their potential for getting meaning from that text, which is not adequate to comprehend the text. The inverse would be that you have a student who is I worked with a student like this. She was hyperlexic, actually, and she could decode any word on a page, but she was also an English language learner, and she had some language processing issues. So she could not understand anything she read initially. She never showed up on screeners as being in need of help because she could decode accurately at a rate that was acceptable, but her language comprehension was lacking. And so, if we were to reverse those numbers, she'd had a 1 with decoding text, 0.5 of language, actually, hers was lower, I'd say 0.25. Then you still have 0.25 for reading for meaning. So, you absolutely, they need to be both present. And the good news about that as a teacher, too, is that we know where to address first, right? So if I have a student who's labored reading word by word, then I'm going to start there. I'm going to make sure that they can decode. I'm going to teach them phonics. And if they don't do well with phonics, I'm going to back up and focus on phonemic awareness. But we would do that at the same time anyway. Language comprehension, I'd focus on the upper strands of Scarborough's rope. There are a lot to go into that. Sorry, I could go on for
I
this
know.
long time. But that is why that is so important. Again,
Well,
one
thank
can't call
you.
the other. It's not as simple as it would be if it were an addition equation.
Yeah, makes sense to me. Let's try to squeeze one more question in, and then when we're done with today's webinar, we'll go through the other questions that are here, and we'll see if Stacy and Donell can answer them offline, and we'll be happy to send you your answers via email. So we have a sound wall question. How do you decide what is appropriate to include in kindergarten?
So in kindergarten, you would start with the phonemes, right? The vowels, because they are familiar with them in speech, and then the thing that would be different in kindergarten as opposed to older grades would be the graphemes or the correspondences that you teach them. And so that's when we would involve letters and we would do very simple progressions. The slide that Donell showed on one side of the screen had a kindergarten sound wall card, and the only 2 graphemes were taught for the sound A, and it was the vowel A, the letter A, and A consonant E at the end of a word. And so you would just make sure the sequence of your phonics instruction is guiding that. But you would teach a lot of the phonemes because they're familiar with those in speech.
Okay. Well, thanks again. That's all the time that we have for questions. Thanks again, Donell and Stacy, for being with us. We will follow up with everybody as the Reading Horizons team with some emails, and we'll try to share as many resources with you as we can. Of course, you can always go to edweb.net/literacyhero and get additional resources from that professional learning community, as well as the recording information from today's session. And one thing, I just want to say one thing, Donell, that you said. I put the link to that really fabulous infographic that you had from IDA in there. And when you were showing that, you were talking about how structured literacy is for everyone, right? And at Reading Horizons, that's really what we're all about. We want to help equip the K-3 teachers with some structured literacy phonics tools so that you can reach all of your students in that tier 1 K-3 classroom, so that we can try to catch them before they start to have the issues that we know we need to address when they get older. So if you're interested in learning more about our curriculum and our tools, you can go to readinghorizons.com, or you can call us at 800-333-0054, and we will hook you up with the representative that is in your geographic region, and we'll be happy to have a conversation with you. Here's some contact information. If you'd like to contact Stacy or Reading Horizons or Donell, you can go ahead and give them an email or give us a call. Thank you so much for attending. We really enjoyed it, and we hope everybody has a great afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.